You've already watched a video discussing how to get at a poem's literal meaning. This set of videos is now going to look at ways of understanding a poem by noticing the literary devices that are used in a poem. And again, I'm going to show you the steps that are involved in noticing the literary devices, and I'm going to give you a demonstration of what that looks like, still using Rainer Maria Rilke's The Cadet Picture of My Father, translated by Robert Lowell. And here are some of the questions that we will end up considering. We're going to think about how the poem reveals what the father is like and the speaker's state of mind. We're also going to think about the poem's overall tone and how the poem establishes this tone. In other words, what elements of the poem reinforce a particular tone or mood. There's a lot of terminology related to literary analysis and specifically the understanding and analysis of poetry. This is a list of many of those terms, and you can find definitions for each of those terms in the glossary that's in the back of your textbook. We won't cover all of these terms in this poem. Every poem doesn't illustrate every poetic device or term, but this poem does illustrate the ones that are highlighted. So those are the ones that we're going to look at. But if these terms are unfamiliar with you, what you want to do is look up the definition so that when you're looking for examples of these devices in the poems that we read, you'll know what you're looking for. And when you're studying a poem, you really don't need to do any additional research. The goal of learning how to read and understand poetry is first to be able to do it kind of on your own without having to look up a commentary on a poem. So this hopefully will help you continue getting confident in that skill. So there are two things that I want you to do before we get started noticing the literary devices. The first thing that I want you to do is to go back and look at Rilke's poem, and I just want you to notice and maybe underline or circle whatever you see as the loaded words in the text. And by loaded words, what I mean is the words that you think have the most significance, or the words that you feel like we need to really pay attention to in order to get at the poem's meaning. And there's no right answer to this. It's really kind of an instinctive thing, and as you continue to study the poem, you may end up going back and underlining and marking, or even just choosing other loaded words or different loaded words. But I just want you to take a minute and underline loaded words, and I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. One thing that we didn't address in the first video is the title. So one important word is cadet, because that lets us know, well, I'm not even going to speculate on why, but the word cadet I think is loaded. Picture, and then father, and not just father, but my father. Those to me strike me as loaded words in the title that are worth looking into a little bit more. So how about you? As you look through the poem, what do you see as some of the loaded words? Go ahead and pause the video, and you can write them down or underline them or highlight them on your copy of the text. After you've underlined the loaded words, the other thing that I want you to do is pause the video again, and I want you to use the glossary in the back of your textbook, and it's the very, very back of your textbook, and I want you to look up the definition for each of the literary terms that's highlighted here. So look up the definition for alliteration, look up the definition for allusion, and go on down the line. It'll take you some time to do this, but I think that you'll find this really helpful as we begin examining the appearance of these literary devices within the poem. And if I were a student in this class, what I would do is either get a few sheets of paper and start myself kind of like a lexicon or my own list of terms with the definitions written down, or I would make flashcards and use them to review because you want to be familiar with these terms. They're really going to help you understand the poetry that we read, and some of them will cross over even into the fiction and the drama that we read. So look up these definitions and then turn the video back on after you've looked them up and feel like you understand them. Now that you've looked up those definitions, you want to keep your definitions on hand because we're going to use them. And these are the steps that we're going to use during these videos, these two videos. We're going to notice how each of the literary devices you just looked up, we're going to notice how each one appears in the poem. We're going to look at where it appears. Then we're going to think about how those literary devices might connect with the loaded words you marked, because you probably noticed those words because they're doing something and the devices help those words accomplish something. And ultimately, we're going to consider the question, what do these literary devices help us understand about the poem and the poem's speaker and the poem's subject, which is the father, and the poem's overall tone. So what we're going to do through the rest of this video and part 2 of this video is kind of work our way through those 3 steps. First, we're briefly going to look at the speaker. The poem tells us about the speaker in the lines that are underlined here. We know that it's a speaker holding a photograph of a father and that the image on the photograph is fading. So there's the language that gives us a little bit of information about the speaker. And I just want to remind you that the speaker is not always the same person as the poet. So the speaker in this poem may be Rilke himself, but the speaker may also be a persona or a fictional character that Rilke has created that has maybe nothing to do with Rilke, or maybe is kind of related to Rilke in some ways but not completely. So you always want to keep that in mind, that the speaker of a text is a literary construct. It's not synonymous with the author of the text. In terms of the subject of the poem, we know that the subject of the poem is the father. In other words, that's what's being focused on in this poem. And I've just kind of circled the sections of the poem that give us information about the father. We'll look at more of this later. Right now we're going to look at a few aspects of sound because, as I've mentioned, poetry is meant to be seen, but it's also meant to be heard, and rhyme has something to do with what a poem sounds like when you look at it. Now, the way to analyze a poem's rhyme scheme is to look at the last word of every line. And if the last words rhyme on different lines, then you have a rhyme scheme. When you look at the last words of this first stanza, touch, boyishness, lips, uniform, bulge, hilt, thing, what you see right away is that there really isn't a rhyme scheme for this poem. So we demarcate that by labeling each line with the letter of the alphabet. And if there was a word, for example, that rhymed with touch that ended another line, then that line would also be labeled with an A. But this poem doesn't really have a set rhyme scheme. As far as the meter or the rhythm, that has to do with the stressed and unstressed syllables that are in a poetic line. And I've underlined the stressed syllables in this poem. So if you're going to read it out loud, the underlined syllables would be the ones that would be stressed in your speech. So it might sound like this. There's absence in the eyes, the brows in touch with something far. Now distant boyishness and seduction shadow his enormous lips. The slender aristocratic uniform with its Franz Joseph braid. Both the hands bulge like gloves upon the saber's basket hilt. The hands are quiet. They reach out toward nothing. So the stressed syllables are the ones that are underlined, and then the unstressed syllables are the syllables or words that are not underlined, and it creates a rhythm. What you see mostly in this poem is 5 stressed syllables per line, not every single line, but mostly, and each of those stressed syllables is preceded by usually an unstressed syllable, but sometimes followed by an unstressed syllable. And that is known as an iamb. There's absence in the eyes, the brows in touch. So that is an iambic line, and it has 5 feet. A foot would be an unstressed and a stressed syllable put together to make up 1 foot. Now, as I mentioned, there are variations on this meter or this metrical pattern, but that is the general rule. And oftentimes, this kind of a poem with this kind of rhythm is meant to mimic one's natural rhythms of speech, so it's a more natural sound. Let's look at alliteration. That has to do with sound also. Alliteration is the repetition of the initial consonant sound in words, and you could see examples of alliteration. Line 3, seduction, shadow, his enormous lips. Of course, that begins with line 2, now, distant boyishness, and seductions or seduction, shadow, his enormous lips. So there's one example of alliteration. A more pronounced example occurs a few lines down where you get the slender aristocratic uniform with its Franz Joseph braid, both the hands bulge like gloves upon the saber basket's hilt. And you even get some more B's both within the word and at the beginning of the word on the next line that emphasize that consonant of B. And then you get something similar in that middle stanza of the poem with the repetition of the consonant D. A lot of times when you hear that kind of alliteration, it draws your attention to the line when you listen to it. It makes it memorable, and sometimes it's intended to draw our attention back to that line so that we'll notice something about it. So we can hear alliteration when we read the poem aloud. And again, those are examples of the alliteration, some of the alliteration that occurs in this poem. But there's also consonants, and consonants is where you get the repetition of a consonant sound within the word. So there you get that S sound, but this time it's in the middle or at the end of the word instead of at the beginning of the word. And when you combine that consonants with the alliteration, you get a more steady pattern of the S sound. As far as simile goes, a simile is a comparison of two things using the word like or as, and we get that in the poem. Also where the alliteration occurs, where the speaker says both the hands bulge like gloves upon the saber basket's hilt. So the hands are bulging, and that bulging in the hands is compared to gloves. If you want to draw some kind of conclusion from that simile or that comparison, you might say that because the hands are bulging, it means that they're gripping and ready to fight. That's one conclusion that one might draw. But again, the simile is intended to attract our attention so that we can speculate on what we're supposed to discern or understand about what's being described or the person being described here. We also have allusion in this poem. The allusion occurs there in line 5 with a reference to Franz Joseph. And we talked about who Franz Joseph is in the previous video where we were looking up unfamiliar terms. Franz Joseph was a king, and it was the king for whom this father fought and was a soldier and served. And I suppose if you wanted to do more study into the poem, one could look up more information about Franz Joseph and see if that might help us get any more information about this soldier who has agreed to fight for this king. But you do have an illusion there. In the next video, we'll shift from looking at aspects of sound and start looking at some of the language and images that appear in the poem.